A single mother, exhausted from working 2 jobs just to survive, gets pulled over late at night by officers who demand cash on the spot, or else they'll destroy her life. When Irene Hopkins refused to pay an illegal fine to make her traffic stop disappear, those officers arrested her, impounded her only car, and wrote a police report so full of lies it could have cost her custody of her daughter. Days later, they walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom expecting the easiest conviction of their careers. After all, who's going to believe a broke waitress with no lawyer over 2 decorated police officers? The defendant stood at the table trembling, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Irene Hopkins's eyes were red and swollen from sleepless nights of crying, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to find words to defend herself against their lies. Across the room, those same officers sat relaxed in their chairs, sharing quiet laughs and confident whispers. They'd done this before. They knew how these cases ended. A single mother with no money for a lawyer against 2 sworn officers? The outcome was predictable. But Judge Frank Caprio, seated behind the bench with his reading glasses perched on his nose and decades of courtroom wisdom in his eyes, watched Irene with an intensity that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. Because something in her fear wasn't the fear of guilt. It was the raw terror of someone who had been cornered, extorted, and left with nowhere to turn except this moment, this courtroom, this judge. The officers noticed nothing. They were too busy celebrating a victory they thought they'd already won. What they didn't know was that Judge Caprio had just spotted the first crack in their story, and he was about to pull on that thread until their entire fabricated narrative collapsed in front of everyone. Before we dive into how this single mother's nightmare became a story of justice that would inspire thousands, hit that subscribe button right now. Let's make sure stories like this reach people who need to see them. Irene Hopkins had never imagined she'd end up in a courtroom. She was just trying to survive, working 2 jobs that left her perpetually exhausted but barely afloat. During the day, she waited tables at a diner where the tips were small and the shifts were long. At night, she stocked shelves at a grocery store, her back aching as she lifted boxes until the early morning hours. Every dollar was counted. Every hour of childcare was precious. Every tank of gas was calculated down to the mile. Her daughter was her entire world. At 7 years old, Emma was everything good that remained in Irene's life after a divorce that had left her with nothing but debt and determination. Irene had sacrificed everything, sleep, social life, dreams of her own, to provide Emma with stability, safety, and a mother who, despite being exhausted, always showed up. That rainy evening started like any other. Irene had just finished a double shift at the grocery store, her muscles screaming for rest, her mind already thinking about tomorrow's waitressing shift. She drove home carefully through the downpour, windshield wipers working overtime, her thoughts focused on one thing: getting home to wrap Emma in a hug before bed. Then the police lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her heart dropped. She pulled over immediately, hands shaking as she reached for her license and registration. She hadn't been speeding, she'd done nothing wrong. Maybe a taillight was out? She couldn't afford a ticket, but she'd figure it out somehow. 2 officers approached her window, and something in their demeanor sent ice through her veins. This wasn't the professional courtesy she'd expected. Their eyes were cold, predatory. One officer tapped his flashlight against her glass with deliberate intimidation. "License and registration," he barked, not asked. Irene complied immediately, her hands trembling as she handed over the documents. "You know why we pulled you over?" the second officer asked, leaning down to peer into her car with an unsettling smirk. She didn't. She genuinely had no idea. "No, officer, I don't think I was—" "Cross the center line back there," the first officer interrupted. Then, almost as an afterthought, "And your taillight's cracked." Irene's mind raced. She hadn't crossed any line, and her taillights had been fine when she'd checked them last week. But before she could process any of this, the second officer changed the story again. "You were driving suspiciously, weaving. You been drinking tonight?" "What? No, I just got off work." "Sure you did." The first officer's tone dripped with sarcasm. Then came the moment that would haunt her for weeks. The second officer leaned in close, his voice dropping to a quiet, threatening whisper that only she could hear. "We can make this easy. Pay a fine now, cash, and you go home to your kid. Otherwise you're coming with us, and your car's getting impounded. Your choice." Irene's blood ran cold. This wasn't a legitimate traffic stop, this was extortion. I can't. I don't carry cash," she stammered, genuine panic rising in her chest. The officer's smirk widened. "Then we'll impound the car. You'll be charged with obstruction, maybe reckless endangerment, maybe resisting arrest if you keep giving us attitude." "Please, I have a daughter waiting." "Should have thought of that before you broke the law." Within minutes that felt like hours, Irene was standing on the side of the rain-soaked road in handcuffs, humiliated and terrified as passing cars slowed to gawk. The officers called for a tow truck while one of them filled out a police report, his pen moving quickly across the paper as he fabricated charge after charge. Resisting arrest, reckless driving, verbal aggression toward officers, failure to comply with lawful orders. None of it was true. Not a single word. They towed her car, her lifeline to both jobs, her only means of getting Emma to school, and left her on that roadside with a court summons and citations carrying fines she could never, ever afford. When the officers finally drove away, Irene stood there in the rain, soaking wet and shaking, and called her neighbor to check on Emma. She tried to keep her voice steady as she explained she'd be late, but the moment she hung up, she collapsed against a street sign and sobbed. The aftermath was a living nightmare. Released from the police station hours later with court dates that loomed like death sentences, Irene couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the impossibility of her situation. It was her word, a broke single mother, against 2 police officers with badges and authority, and a police report that painted her as a dangerous criminal. Who would believe her? Who would even listen? She spent sleepless nights terrified she'd lose Emma, terrified she'd lose her jobs without her car, terrified the court would see her as exactly what those officers had written. A hostile, reckless woman who'd brought this on herself. The weight of their word against hers was crushing. And as the court date approached, that weight only grew heavier. The morning of the hearing, Irene arrived at the courthouse an hour early. She'd barely slept, her stomach twisted in knots, and she'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on the only professional outfit she owned. A blazer she'd bought at a thrift store years ago, and a skirt that was a little too tight now from stress eating during sleepless nights. Her hands shook as she filled out paperwork at the clerk's window. Around her, other defendants and their families shuffled through their own legal troubles, but Irene felt utterly alone. She clutched a worn folder containing everything she hoped might help. Work schedules proving she'd been employed that night, character references from her employers, a letter from Emma's teacher. Anything, everything. It felt pathetically inadequate. Then the officers arrived. They entered through the courthouse doors with an ease that made Irene's stomach turn. Their uniforms were crisp and perfectly pressed, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They walked with the confident stride of men who owned this space, who'd walked these halls 100 times before and always walked out victorious. One of them, the officer who'd demanded the cash payment, spotted Irene sitting on a bench near the courtroom entrance. Their eyes met for just a second, and he gave her the smallest, most dismissive smirk before turning to laugh quietly with his partner about something completely unrelated to the destruction they'd caused in her life. They approached the prosecutor, shaking hands like old friends. The easy familiarity between them made Irene's heart sink even further. These men clearly did this all the time. This was routine for them. Another day, another conviction, another powerless person crushed under the weight of a fabricated police report. The second officer actually yawned as they waited for court to begin, checking his phone with the bored expression of someone waiting in line at the DMV. Their body language screamed one message louder than words ever could. This is already over. We've already won. We always win. When the bailiff finally called for everyone to rise as Judge Caprio entered, Irene stood on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. She watched the judge take his seat, scan the courtroom with sharp, observant eyes, and begin reviewing the case file in front of him. Judge Frank Caprio had a reputation in Providence. People called him fair but firm, compassionate, but no nonsense. Irene had heard stories of his courtroom, watched videos online of him showing mercy to struggling people while holding the powerful accountable. But as she stood there trembling, hope felt dangerous. Hope felt like something that would only make the inevitable disappointment hurt worse. The judge's expression remained neutral as he read through the initial documents. But Irene noticed something. His eyes kept returning to certain sections of the police report. His pen moved across the pages, making notes, circling things, underlining passages. When Irene's case was called, she stepped forward to the defendant's table on shaking legs. The courtroom seemed to close in around her. Every eye felt like a judgment. Every whisper felt like a conviction. Judge Caprio looked up from the file, and his eyes met hers. For just a moment, his expression softened, not with pity, but with something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who'd seen enough courtrooms, enough cases, enough people to know when something wasn't adding up. The officers noticed nothing. They were too busy settling into their seats, relaxed and ready to deliver their rehearsed testimony. What they didn't realize was that Judge Caprio had already begun to suspect them. Small inconsistencies in their report, phrases that sounded too practiced, details that didn't quite align. He'd spent decades on the bench, and his instincts were screaming that something about this case was wrong. Very wrong. The prosecutor stood and read the charges in a flat, routine monotone. Reckless driving, resisting arrest, verbal aggression toward officers, failure to comply with lawful orders. The words hung in the air like accusations carved in stone. The first officer took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd done this countless times. His testimony was smooth, practiced, perfectly coordinated with what his partner had obviously rehearsed. Ms. Hopkins was driving erratically, Your Honor, weaving between lanes. When we activated our lights, she took nearly a quarter mile to pull over, which we interpreted as possible evasion. He spoke clearly, maintaining eye contact with the judge. Upon approach, she became immediately hostile, raised her voice, refused to provide documentation without argument. When we informed her she was being cited, she became verbally aggressive and physically resistant. It was a master class in lying. Every word delivered with the weight of authority. Every detail designed to paint Irene as dangerous, unstable, someone who'd brought this entirely upon herself. The second officer corroborated everything with mechanical precision. Their stories aligned perfectly, too perfectly, Judge Caprio noted, for a chaotic roadside encounter in the rain. Then it was Irene's turn. She stood at the witness stand, her voice so quiet the court reporter had to ask her twice to speak up. With shaking hands gripping the railing, Irene began to explain what had actually happened. "I wasn't weaving. I was driving carefully because of the rain." Her voice cracked. "I pulled over immediately when I saw the lights. I gave them my license right away. I was respectful. I was terrified, but I was respectful." Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly. "Go on." "They kept changing their reason for stopping me. First it was crossing the center line, then a cracked tail light, then suspicious driving. Then they—" She paused, tears streaming down her face now. "They told me I could pay them cash right there, or they'd arrest me and impound my car." The courtroom went very still. "I told them I didn't have cash. I'd just gotten off work. I just wanted to get home to my daughter." Irene's voice broke completely. "I wasn't resisting. I was terrified. I didn't do any of the things they wrote in that report. I swear to God I didn't." Her authenticity was palpable. This wasn't a rehearsed defense. This was raw fear and desperate truth pouring out of someone who'd been cornered with nowhere left to turn. Judge Caprio studied her carefully, then turned his attention back to the officers. His expression had shifted subtly. The neutral judicial mask had given way to something sharper, more focused. "Ms. Hopkins," he said gently, "you said they asked for cash. Can you explain that in more detail? What exactly did they say?" Irene described the extortion attempt, her voice shaking as she recounted the quiet threat, the smirk, the casual cruelty of officers who believed she was too powerless to fight back. As she spoke, Judge Caprio noticed the officers shifting in their seats. Just slightly, just enough. When Irene finished, Judge Caprio turned to the officers with a question that seemed simple but landed like a bombshell. "Officers, I don't see any body camera footage included with this report. Can you explain why?" The first officer didn't miss a beat. "Both cameras malfunctioned, Your Honor. Technical issue." Judge Caprio's eyebrows rose slowly. "Both of your cameras? At the exact same time?" The second officer jumped in quickly, perhaps too quickly. "It happens sometimes, Your Honor. Technical issues with the equipment, battery problems." "That's quite the coincidence," Judge Caprio said, his voice cooling noticeably. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor glanced at the officers with the first hint of confusion crossing his face. Judge Caprio wasn't done. He flipped through the file again, his frown deepening. "I have another question. Why is there no dispatch log for this stop?" The officers exchanged the briefest of glances, a microsecond of panic that Judge Caprio caught immediately. "We were responding to another call in the area, Your Honor," the first officer said. "Things moved fast. The stop was incidental to—" "So you pulled someone over without reporting it to dispatch?" Judge Caprio's tone had shifted from curious to sharp. "You made an arrest, impounded a vehicle, filed multiple charges, all without informing your department's dispatch that you'd initiated a traffic stop." Silence. The confident smirks had vanished. In their place was something new, the first real flash of fear. Judge Caprio closed the file with deliberate slowness. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gavel strike. "I'm calling a recess." His voice carried absolute authority. "Bailiff, I want dispatch logs, GPS records from both patrol vehicles, and any incident reports filed by these officers for the past 3 months. I also want body camera maintenance records from the department." The officers' faces drained of color. "And someone contact the police department's internal affairs division. Tell them I need a representative here within the hour." Whispers exploded through the courtroom. Irene's eyes went wide with something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The prosecutor looked genuinely shocked, flipping through his own papers as if seeing them for the first time. As the bailiff announced the recess, Judge Caprio stood. Before leaving the bench, he looked directly at the two officers. "Don't leave the building." In his chambers, Judge Frank Caprio made phone calls personally. This wasn't something he delegated. His instincts, honed over decades of courtroom experience, were screaming, and he'd learned long ago to trust them. "I need dispatch logs for Officers Randall and Chen," he said into the phone, speaking directly with the police department's records division. "The night of October 15th, approximately 11 p.m. to midnight. I also need GPS location data for both patrol vehicles during that window." While waiting, he had his assistant pull up the civilian complaint database. If these officers were running an extortion scheme, Irene Hopkins likely wasn't their first victim. 20 minutes later, a clerk rushed into his chambers carrying printed records. Judge Caprio spread them across his desk, and what he found made his jaw clench with barely contained anger. The GPS data showed both officers' vehicles were nowhere near their assigned patrol sector when they'd stopped Irene. They'd been more than 4 miles outside their designated area, on a stretch of road known for late-night shift workers heading home, people who were tired, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back. The dispatch logs were even more damning. There was no record of the traffic stop, no call-in, no report of the arrest, no request for the tow truck that had impounded Irene's car. According to official records, that entire encounter had never happened. But the body camera maintenance logs were what confirmed Judge Caprio's worst suspicions. Both cameras had been inspected and certified operational just 3 days before the incident. Both had recorded footage earlier that same shift, a routine traffic stop that the officers had properly logged. Both cameras had resumed recording after Irene's arrest. They'd only malfunctioned during the exact 12-minute window when Irene had been stopped, extorted, and arrested. Then came the detail that transformed this from misconduct into a pattern. Judge Caprio's assistant found 2 civilian complaints filed against Officers Randall and Chen within the same month. Both described late-night traffic stops. Both mentioned demands for immediate cash payment. Both involved threats of vehicle impoundment. One complaint came from a college student who'd paid $300 cash to avoid arrest. Another from an elderly man who'd been told to pay now or spend the night in jail. Both complainants had dropped their cases shortly after filing. The notes indicated they'd received follow-up contact from the officers, likely intimidation disguised as official police business. Judge Caprio read every word, his expression darkening with each page. This wasn't a single incident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was systematic corruption. Predatory officers hunting vulnerable people who they believed couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. Irene sat alone at the defendant's table, hardly daring to breathe, prayers running through her mind on an endless loop. "Please, please let someone finally believe me." The officers stood in the hallway, their earlier confidence completely shattered. One pulled out his phone, likely calling someone at the precinct. The other paced, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool courthouse air. They knew something had gone horribly wrong. They just didn't know how wrong yet. When the bailiff called court back into session, Judge Caprio returned carrying a folder that had grown considerably thicker. His demeanor had transformed completely. The curious judge had become something else entirely, an instrument of justice preparing to strike. The officers walked back in, their movements stiff, their faces pale. The swagger was gone, the smirks were gone. In their place was the unmistakable look of people realizing they'd finally been caught. Irene looked up at Judge Caprio, hope and fear battling in her eyes. She'd been knocked down so many times. Could she dare to believe this might be different? Judge Caprio opened the thick folder deliberately, letting the silence build until the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. "Officers," he said, his voice measured but dangerous, "I've reviewed the additional records, and I have some questions." Judge Caprio opened the expanded file with deliberate slowness. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. "Officers Randall and Chen," he began, his tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You stated in your testimony that you were responding to a call when you encountered Ms. Hopkins. What was the nature of that call?" Officer Randall, the one who'd done most of the talking, cleared his throat. "There was a report of suspicious activity, Your Honor, near the intersection of Broad and Westminster." "What kind of suspicious activity?" A possible prowler. Resident called it in." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, then read from the dispatch log in front of him. "According to the official dispatch records, there were no calls about suspicious activity anywhere near that intersection on the night in question." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Officer Randall's face flushed red. "It might have been a different intersection. It was a busy night." "Let me save you some time, officer. According to these GPS records," Judge Caprio held up a printed sheet, "your patrol vehicle was located at the intersection where you stopped Ms. Hopkins. That intersection is 4.7 miles from Broad and Westminster. In fact, it's not even in your assigned patrol sector." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor stood halfway, then sat back down looking utterly blindsided. "Furthermore," Judge Caprio continued, his voice rising above the murmurs, "according to GPS tracking, you were off your designated patrol route entirely. You were in Sector 7. Your assignment that night was Sector 3. Officer Chen, who'd been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. "We were pursuing a vehicle that had—" "Without calling it in?" Judge Caprio's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "Without requesting backup? Without informing dispatch you were leaving your sector, pursuing a suspect, or making a traffic stop?" The officers had no answer. Their practiced coordination was crumbling. "Let's talk about these body cameras." Judge Caprio held up another document. "According to your department's maintenance logs, both of your cameras were inspected and deemed fully operational 3 days before this incident. Is that correct?" Officer Randall nodded reluctantly. "Both cameras recorded footage earlier that same shift during a routine traffic stop at 9:47 p.m. Is that also correct?" Another reluctant nod. "Both cameras resumed recording at 11:43 p.m., after Ms. Hopkins was already in custody and her vehicle was being towed. Correct?" "Yes, but—" Judge Caprio's voice rose with barely contained fury. "So these cameras only malfunctioned during the exact 12-minute window when you stopped Ms. Hopkins, allegedly witnessed all this reckless driving and verbal aggression, made the arrest, and arranged for the tow. That is your testimony?" The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Chen cracked first. His face had gone from pale to bright red, sweat dripping down his temples. "Look, I told him we should have reported it properly." "Shut up," Officer Randall hissed, his composure completely shattered. The courtroom exploded. Judge Caprio slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in this court!" But the damage was done. The two officers had just contradicted each other, and everyone in the courtroom had witnessed it. When silence finally returned, Judge Caprio delivered his next revelation. "I have here 2 additional civilian complaints filed against both of you." He read from the documents with cold precision. September 8th, a college student named Maria Gonzalez reported being stopped by Officers Randall and Chen at 10:30 p.m. She claimed you demanded $300 cash to avoid arrest and vehicle impoundment. She paid. She later attempted to file a complaint but dropped it after receiving what she described as threatening phone calls. Irene's hand flew to her mouth. September 22nd, an elderly man named Robert Chen, no relation, reported a similar stop. He was told to pay now or spend the night in jail. He couldn't afford the cash. You arrested him on fabricated charges. Those charges were later dropped, but not before he'd spent 8 hours in lockup and paid $200 in towing fees. Judge Caprio looked up from the documents, his eyes blazing. Both incidents occurred on late-night shifts. Both occurred off your assigned routes. Both involved victims who were alone, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back. Both involved your body cameras mysteriously malfunctioning, and in both cases, there were no dispatch logs of the stops. Officer Randall stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "This is ridiculous. She's lying. They're all lying. Your Honor, we serve this community with—" "You extorted this community." Judge Caprio's voice thundered through the courtroom with such force that several people jumped in their seats. "You preyed on people you believed were too powerless to fight back. You fabricated evidence. You abused your authority. You are exactly the kind of corruption that destroys public trust in law enforcement." Officer Randall's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Officer Chen sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. The courtroom sat in stunned, absolute silence. Judge Frank Caprio stood behind the bench, and the authority in the room was absolute. Every eye was on him. Every breath was held. "Ms. Irene Hopkins," he said, his voice firm but no longer angry. "Please stand." Irene rose on trembling legs, tears already streaming down her face. She'd been holding on to hope by the thinnest thread, and now that thread felt like it might actually hold. Judge Caprio looked directly at her, and his expression softened with something that might have been fatherly compassion. "The charges against you are completely and utterly dismissed." Irene gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as a sob escaped. Her legs nearly gave out, and she gripped the table to keep from collapsing. "You did nothing wrong," Judge Caprio continued. "You were the victim of a crime, and this court apologizes that you were put through this ordeal." Irene couldn't stop crying. But these weren't tears of fear anymore. These were tears of relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting from her chest. Judge Caprio then turned to the two officers, and his expression hardened into something that could have been carved from granite. "As for you two—" The officers stood, Officer Randall trying one last time to maintain some shred of dignity. Officer Chen looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "You abused your authority," Judge Caprio said, his voice cold and measured. "You terrorized innocent people. You fabricated evidence and filed false police reports. You preyed on those you believed were too powerless to fight back. Single mothers, college students, elderly citizens. People who trusted you to protect them." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This court is referring both of you to the Internal Affairs Division for immediate investigation. I am also forwarding copies of all these records to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges, including extortion, filing false reports, abuse of authority, and conspiracy." Officer Randall opened his mouth to protest. "You can't do this!" "Bailiff," Judge Caprio interrupted, "if he speaks again, hold him in contempt of court." Two internal affairs investigators who'd arrived during the recess stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. They'd been waiting, listening, documenting everything. They approached the two officers with the grim efficiency of people who'd seen this too many times before. "Officers Randall and Chen, you're ordered to surrender your badges and weapons immediately. You're suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation." Officer Chen stood quietly, his face buried in his hands, defeated. Officer Randall tried one last desperate protest. "This is a witch hunt. We served this city for—" "You served yourselves," Judge Caprio cut him off. "You used your badges to prey on the vulnerable. Now face the consequences." The IAD investigators escorted both officers toward the courtroom exit. The gallery watched in stunned silence as two men who'd entered with such arrogance now shuffled out in complete humiliation. As they passed Irene's table, Officer Chen glanced at her briefly. Whether it was guilt or resentment in his eyes, Irene couldn't tell. She didn't care anymore. They were gone. The nightmare was over. As the courtroom doors closed behind the officers, the gallery erupted in applause. The sound was so sudden and so loud that Judge Caprio had to use his gavel to restore order, though even he seemed to understand the catharsis the crowd needed to express. When silence returned, Judge Caprio spoke directly to Irene again. "Ms. Hopkins, I am deeply sorry for what you endured. What happened to you should never happen to anyone in this community. You were the victim of criminals who happened to wear badges." Irene could barely see him through her tears. "Your record will be cleared completely. All fines and fees are dismissed. The court will ensure your vehicle is returned to you immediately, with all towing and impound fees waived." A victim advocate from the courthouse staff approached the table, placing a gentle hand on Irene's shoulder and offering a tissue and a card with support resources. Judge Caprio continued, "I'm also going to personally ensure that the District Attorney's Office provides you with any support you need, including compensation for the losses you've suffered as a result of this illegal arrest." Irene finally managed to speak, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You showed tremendous courage coming here today," Judge Caprio said. "You could have been intimidated into silence like others before you. Instead, you stood up for the truth. That took real strength." Irene nodded, unable to form more words, her body shaking with the release of weeks of accumulated terror and stress. Outside the courthouse, Irene stepped into brilliant autumn sunlight that felt like a benediction. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe without the crushing weight of fear pressing down on her chest. Her neighbor had brought Emma to the courthouse steps. The moment Irene saw her daughter, she broke into a run. Emma crashed into her mother's arms, and Irene lifted her up, spinning her around despite her exhausted muscles, despite everything. "Mommy, are we okay now?" Emma asked, her small hands cupping Irene's tear-stained face. "Yes, baby," Irene whispered, holding her daughter so tight. "We're okay. We're finally okay." The news of the case spread through Providence like wildfire. Local media picked up the story. "Judge Caprio exposes police corruption ring." Social media erupted with support for Irene and outrage at the officers who'd terrorized her. But more importantly, other victims began to come forward. Emboldened by Irene's vindication, men and women who'd been too afraid to speak up started sharing their stories. Maria Gonzalez, the college student who'd paid the $300, contacted the district attorney's office. Robert Chen, the elderly man who'd been arrested, filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. The investigation expanded rapidly. Within days, detectives discovered that officers Randall and Chen had been running their extortion scheme for over a year, targeting vulnerable people on late-night shifts when oversight was minimal. They'd collected an estimated $15,000 in illegal payments from victims who'd been too scared to fight back. Both officers were formally charged with multiple felonies: extortion, filing false reports, abuse of authority, conspiracy, and intimidation of witnesses. Their trial would become one of the most closely watched cases in Providence's recent history. The police chief issued a public apology and announced sweeping reforms: mandatory body camera policies with severe penalties for malfunctions, random audits of traffic stops and dispatch logs, and a new civilian oversight committee to investigate misconduct complaints. For Irene, life began to shift in ways she'd never imagined. With her record cleared and her story public, community members rallied around her. Her employer at the diner gave her additional hours with better tips. A local mechanic, moved by her story, performed a complete inspection and repair of her car free of charge. A legal aid organization reached out, offering to help her file a civil lawsuit against the officers and the police department. The settlement, they explained, could provide financial stability she'd never known: money for Emma's education, a safety net against future emergencies, maybe even a down payment on a small house. But more valuable than any financial compensation was something Irene had lost and finally regained: her faith that justice could exist for people like her, that someone in power could actually listen, actually investigate, actually care. 1 month after the trial, Irene returned to the courthouse. She brought Judge Caprio a handwritten thank you note and a photo of Emma smiling on her first day at a new school, a better school in a safer neighborhood that Irene could now afford. "You saved us," she told him, tears in her eyes once again. But these were different tears, happy tears, grateful tears. Judge Caprio, characteristically humble, shook his head gently. "I only did what was right, Ms. Hopkins. You saved yourself by having the courage to tell the truth, even when you had every reason to believe no one would listen." He looked at the photo of Emma, smiled, and placed it carefully on his desk among other mementos from cases that had meant something beyond the law. "Never forget that courage," he said. "Your daughter is watching. You showed her that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for, and that one person standing up can make all the difference." As Irene left his chambers, Judge Caprio watched from his window as she walked across the courthouse plaza, her head held high in a way it hadn't been the first time he'd seen her. That evening, Irene started a support group for victims of police misconduct. It met weekly in a community center, offering a safe space for people to share their stories, connect with legal resources, and find strength in numbers. At the first meeting, 7 people showed up. Within 3 months, that number had grown to 35. Irene Hopkins had walked into Judge Caprio's courtroom as a victim, powerless, terrified, and alone. She walked out as something else entirely: a survivor, an advocate, and living proof that the system could still work when good people refused to look away from injustice. Officers Randall and Chen were eventually convicted on multiple counts. Randall received a sentence of 6 years in prison. Chen, who'd cooperated with prosecutors and shown genuine remorse, received 3 years with the possibility of parole. The college student got her $300 back, plus additional compensation. The elderly man received a formal apology and enough money to cover his medical bills from the stress of his ordeal. And Irene? She never forgot the terror of those weeks between her arrest and her vindication. But she also never forgot the moment Judge Frank Caprio looked at her, really looked at her, and chose to believe the truth over convenient lies. She kept the dismissed charges paperwork framed in her apartment, not as a reminder of her nightmare, but as a testament to what happened when courage met justice. Irene Hopkins walked into that courtroom as a victim, terrified and powerless against a system that seemed designed to crush people like her. She walked out, vindicated, protected, and free. Two corrupt officers who thought their badges made them untouchable learned that true authority lies not in a uniform, but in integrity. And Judge Frank Caprio proved once again why his courtroom has become a beacon of hope for those who believe the justice system can still work for everyday people. Because sometimes it only takes one person willing to ask the right questions to bring down an entire wall of lies. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to see more incredible moments of real justice. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that truth still matters and that standing up for what's right is never in vain. The fight for justice continues, and your support helps these stories reach people who need hope.